When we picture the first European arrivals, we imagine pioneers arriving with blueprints for a new nation. The reality was a scramble for sheer survival, freezing temperatures, and immediate, agonizing starvation. In those initial years, death was the norm. Over half of the Mayflower passengers died in their first winter. Jamestown was nearly abandoned entirely after a period known as the Starving Time. There was no room to recreate the lives they left behind in Europe. To keep breathing, these arrivals had to abandon their old world habits and submit to whatever the local land demanded. The colonies only stabilized once the settlers began to adapt. In places like Plymouth, local Native American groups, particularly the Wampanoag, taught the colonists how to cultivate indigenous crops like maize.
Further south, settlers discovered their economic lifeline. They found they could grow high-demand cash crops, like these rows of young tobacco plants, creating a reliable revenue source that made permanent settlement viable. As survival turned into expansion, the colonies hit a massive developmental bottleneck. They had seemingly endless land, but a severe labor shortage. There simply weren't enough hands. How a settler solved that labor shortage and the daily routine they built to survive came down to a single variable: the specific geography of where their boat happened to land. This topological map shows the New England coastline. Notice the poor, rocky soil and mountainous terrain pushing right up to the water. This terrain made sprawling, large-scale agriculture physically impossible. Unable to spread out across massive individual farms, settlers were forced to cluster together. They built tight-knit, densely populated villages centered around a common green. This close-quarters geography perfectly suited the people who settled there. Strict Puritan religious beliefs demanded highly regulated, community-focused lives, where neighbors kept a close eye on one another's behavior. Instead of planting vast fields, these communities looked to the water. They harnessed local rivers to power grain and sawmills, used deep coastal harbors for a shipping and timber economy. By preventing large-scale farming, the harsh New England soil inadvertently forced the creation of America's first localized industrial and commercial hubs. Moving south to New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, the landscape opens up into a forgiving middle ground. Here, settlers found highly fertile soil, easily accessible forests, and deep river networks stretching inland. As this flowchart illustrates, welcoming geography acted as a magnet for European immigrants, creating intense demographic diversity. The data shifts to show economic output split evenly between the interior, harvesting massive amounts of grain, and the coast, where port cities managed the trade. With its varied landscape and diverse population, the middle colonies established the prototype for the multicultural, mixed-economy melting pot. Further down the coast in the southern colonies, the geography changes again. The Tidewater region offered vast, flat expanses of rich, nutrient-dense soil. This land was suited for massive agriculture. Settlers spread out, building isolated, sprawling plantations dedicated to growing high-yield, labor-intensive cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. Cultivating these vast plantations required thousands of hands, bringing that severe labor shortage back to the forefront. The relentless demand of Southern agriculture required a massive bound workforce. The initial solution came from Europe. Over half of all European immigrants to the colonies arrived as indentured servants, signing contracts that traded 4 to 7 years of labor for passage across the Atlantic. By the 1660s, as the demand for labor exploded, this system hardened into something far more brutal. The temporary servitude of Europeans was replaced by the lifelong, hereditary chattel enslavement of millions of kidnapped Africans. The immense wealth of the southern colonies and the isolated daily life of its white planters became dependent on the systematic exploitation of unfree labor. By the 1700s, these geographic adaptations had cemented themselves. There was absolutely no single, unified American experience. A merchant in the Boston Harbor, a German farmer in the Pennsylvania hills, and an enslaved person in a Carolina rice field occupied separate worlds, each shaped by the specific demands of their local landscape. These differences were allowed to flourish due to a British policy known as salutary neglect. By avoiding strict enforcement of parliamentary laws, the Crown effectively left these distinct regions alone to govern their own daily routines. Left to their own devices, separated by vast distances and poor roads, These local adaptations hardened into deeply rooted regional identities. Salutary neglect did foster one shared trait across the colonies, a fierce, independent spirit born from decades of self-management. But it also preserved a deep fault line. This comparison map shows the sharp contrast between the industrialized commercial economy of the North and the massive slave labor plantation economy of the South. As the population grew and the borders expanded, these economic engines locked into place. Decades of geographic adaptation had produced two divergent societies anchored to the same coast. The specific geography that dictated how the earliest settlers survived their first winters had set the colonies on diverging paths, creating a national identity that was fractured from its inception.